The federal courtroom was completely silent. Not a sound, not even the shuffle of a paper. All eyes were fixed on Judge Edith H. Jones, one of the most respected judges in the United States. For nearly 40 years, she had carried the weight of justice on her shoulders. Her courtroom was a place of fairness, discipline, and quiet authority. But today felt different. Today, something heavy lingered in the air. Across the room stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, a passionate new voice in Congress, known for her fire, her boldness, and her sharp opinions. She was younger, full of energy, and unafraid to speak her mind. But now, standing in the quiet dignity of a federal courtroom, even she seemed to sense that this was not going to be an ordinary day. Judge Jones leaned forward slightly, her eyes calm but firm. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her voice carrying across the room, steady and commanding. "Your recent comments about our justice system are troubling. Your approach to judicial independence shows a serious misunderstanding of the Constitution." The words dropped into the silence. Like stones into deep water, no one moved. No one even breathed. Legal scholars, reporters, and everyday citizens sat frozen, knowing they were witnessing something historic. A direct exchange between two women representing the two pillars of American democracy, the judiciary and the legislature. What followed would become one of the most talked about moments in modern American public life. Judge Jones was a legend in the world of law. Born in Philadelphia, raised with firm traditional values, she had graduated from Cornell University and the University of Texas School of Law at a time when women in the legal field were rare. She was brilliant, disciplined, and deeply devoted to the Constitution. For nearly 4 decades, she had served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, shaping countless opinions with logic, restraint, and wisdom. Her colleagues respected her. Her critics, even when they disagreed, admired her fairness. To her, the Constitution was not a matter of convenience. It was a sacred promise. Recently, however, she had grown deeply troubled. She saw more and more politicians publicly criticizing judges, suggesting that court rulings were political or biased whenever they didn't go their way. To her, such words weren't just careless. They were dangerous. They risked weakening the one thing that protected every American: faith in the rule of law. Representative Jasmine Crockett came from a very different world. A 43-year-old congresswoman from Texas. She had made her name as a civil rights lawyer, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Her heart was big, her voice strong, her ambition clear. She wanted to fix what she saw as deep injustice in the system. But sometimes, her passion ran ahead of her caution. In speeches and interviews, she had recently accused federal judges of being stuck in old thinking. She had said their decisions blocked progress, and that respect must be earned, not demanded. Those words had made headlines and made Judge Jones take notice. The annual Federal Judicial Conference had seemed like a perfect chance for dialogue. Crockett had been invited to speak about justice reform. She came prepared with statistics, stories, and solutions. Her presentation began smoothly. She spoke with emotion about sentencing disparities, the struggles of poor defendants, and the flaws in the prison system. The judges listened, respectful and attentive. But halfway through, something changed. Her voice sharpened. "Too many judges," she declared, "hide behind old traditions and ignore the need for change. If our laws don't evolve, they become tools of injustice." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others frowned. Judge Jones, seated in the front row, stayed perfectly still. But those who knew her saw the tightening of her jaw, the small signs that she was troubled. Crockett pressed on. "When the courts protect power instead of people, we have a duty to call that out." Her words echoed off the marble walls. By the time she finished, the tension was so thick, that you could almost feel it pressing down on everyone in the room. Then quietly, Judge Jones stood up. The crowd fell completely silent again. Every camera lens turned toward her. Even at 74, she moved with the grace and authority that came from decades of leadership. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said firmly, "I appreciate your passion, but I must address what you've said. When you suggest that judges should rule based on desired outcomes instead of the law, you attack the very foundation of judicial independence." Crockett blinked. Surprised but attentive, the judge continued, "The Constitution demands that judges interpret laws as written, not as they wish them to be. If our rulings are unpopular, that is not failure. That is fidelity to the rule of law." The words carried the quiet thunder of truth. Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. She just listened. Then, with a calm and steady tone, she said something no one expected. "Judge Jones, I appreciate your honesty. Could you help me understand where I may have gone wrong?" It was simple, humble, and real. The room felt it instantly. Reporters froze mid-note. Even the bailiffs turned their heads. In an age of pride and politics, here was humility, genuine humility, spoken aloud. Judge Jones paused, studying the younger woman. Her tone softened. "Congresswoman," she said, "your passion for justice is admirable, but the courts cannot chase political wins. We must follow law and precedent. When lawmakers criticize judges for following the law, it weakens public trust. And when that trust dies, so does liberty." Crockett nodded slowly, her expression changing from defiance to reflection. "I see now," she said. "I think my frustration made me speak in ways I shouldn't have. I never meant to insult the courts. I just want justice to reach everyone." Her voice trembled slightly, but it was sincere. Judge Jones's eyes softened, and for the first time, a faint smile crossed her face. "That is exactly what we all want, Congresswoman," she said. "Justice for everyone. But to achieve that, each branch must respect the other. You write the laws. We interpret them. That is how the system stays strong." The audience was motionless. Something beautiful was happening. The kind of exchange that felt rare in modern times. A moment of learning, not shouting. Understanding, not accusation. Crockett spoke again. "So you're saying if I want different results, I need to change the laws themselves, not blame the judges who follow them?" "Exactly," Judge Jones replied. "We judges are bound by what Congress creates. We see flaws every day. Unfair sentencing, rigid guidelines, unjust outcomes. But our oath requires us to apply the law as written. If you want better justice, improve the law. Don't attack the people who apply it." Crockett slowly nodded again. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted. The mood in the courtroom began to shift. What had begun as confrontation was turning into connection. Reporters lowered their cameras. Lawyers looked on with quiet awe. Then softly, Judge Jones said, "When leaders admit mistakes, democracy grows stronger. And when we listen instead of argue, we learn what unity really means." Crockett's eyes glistened. "Thank you, Judge," she said. "You've given me more to think about today than most debates ever have." For a moment, there was silence again. But it wasn't tense anymore. It was peaceful. A deep, reflective quiet filled the courtroom, the kind that only comes after truth is spoken. Then, one person began to clap. Another joined, and within seconds, the entire room was applauding. Even the usually stern court clerks were smiling. Judge Jones raised her hand gently, signaling for calm. She looked around the room, then spoke with warmth and authority. "What we've witnessed today," she said, "is what America needs. Honest words, mutual respect, and the courage to admit when we're wrong. That's how this great nation stays strong." Her words drew another wave of applause, louder this time. For almost a full minute, the sound echoed through the courtroom. A sound not of division, but of unity and hope. That afternoon, the story began to spread. Clips of the exchange appeared online. People everywhere watched, shared, and commented. Finally, some wrote, "A moment of real leadership." Others said it made them believe again that respect and decency was still alive in American public life. By evening, the video had gone viral. News anchors called it the moment humility met wisdom. But for the people who had been there, it was something even greater. It was proof that honor, respect, and learning still had a place in the heart of democracy. And though the confrontation had ended, the story was far from over, because what happened after that day, what these two women did next, would go on to inspire millions. And trust me, you won't want to miss what came next, because that's where the true transformation begins. In the days after the courtroom exchange, something remarkable started to happen. The video of Judge Jones and Representative Crockett spread like wildfire across television, newspapers, and social media. People who had never agreed on anything before were suddenly united by a shared feeling of respect and hope. It wasn't a partisan story. It wasn't about left or right. It was about grace, humility, and the idea that wisdom still mattered in public life. Morning shows replayed the clip. Talk radio hosts quoted Judge Jones's words about the Constitution. Commentators from both sides of the aisle admitted they couldn't remember the last time they had seen such honesty from an elected official. And in the middle of all that attention stood Jasmine Crockett, the young congresswoman who had turned criticism into courage. Instead of hiding from the spotlight, she faced it head-on. In interview after interview, she spoke openly about what had happened. "I realized that I'd let frustration guide my words," she said softly on one national broadcast. Judge Jones reminded me that respect is not weakness, it's strength. Those simple sentences hit home for millions. People saw something rare in her. A public servant willing to learn, not just argue. Letters poured into her office. Veterans wrote to thank her for restoring their faith in leadership. Retired teachers said they replayed the clip for their students as an example of humility. Even a few fellow lawmakers admitted that her change of heart made them think twice about how they spoke about the courts. But the biggest impact came when Judge Jones herself was asked about the incident. She sat in her chambers, surrounded by shelves of worn law books, and smiled gently at the question. "The Congresswoman showed great courage," she said. "Humility is not a sign of weakness. It is the beginning of wisdom." Those words were printed in every major newspaper the next morning. People clipped the quote, shared it, and repeated it to one another, as if rediscovering an old truth they had forgotten. While the media buzzed, something deeper was happening behind the scenes. Crockett couldn't stop thinking about that day. She replayed it in her mind. The judge's calm voice, the weight of her words, the way the entire courtroom changed. When respect replaced pride, she realized she had a choice to make. She could let the moment fade, or she could build on it. So she picked up her phone and called Judge Jones directly. The judge answered in her usual composed tone. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "this is a pleasant surprise." Crockett hesitated for a second and then said, "Judge Jones, I've been thinking a lot since that day. I want to do something more. Would you consider meeting with me privately? I'd like to learn from you." There was a brief pause, and then a warm laugh on the other end. "I'd be honored," the judge replied, and that single call began one of the most unexpected friendships in modern politics. A week later, Crockett traveled to Houston to meet the judge at her chambers. The office was quiet and filled with history. Framed photos of the Supreme Court, portraits of past justices, and a large American flag standing in one corner. Judge Jones greeted her with a firm handshake and invited her to sit. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the judge said, "I'm glad you reached out. It's easy to move on from moments like that, but the real test is what you do afterward." Crockett nodded. "That's why I'm here," she said. I want to understand the balance between reform and respect. I still believe we need to fix things, but I also know we can't break trust while doing it." The judge smiled slightly. "Good, because reform built on respect lasts longer than reform built on anger." Over the next few hours, they talked openly about law, leadership, and the meaning of public service. Crockett asked questions. The judge shared stories from decades on the bench, cases that had kept her up at night, lessons about patience and restraint, moments when following the law meant enduring public criticism. "Being a judge," she said, "means accepting that you won't always be liked, but it also means standing firm, so the Constitution remains steady when everything else shakes." Crockett listened closely, scribbling notes in a small notebook. She felt like a student again. At one point she asked, "Judge, do you ever wish you could change the law yourself when you see something unfair?" Jones leaned back thoughtfully. "Many times," she admitted. "But if judges start rewriting the law, we lose the very thing that protects citizens from our own opinions. That's why your job in Congress is so important. You hold the pen that can fix what we can only interpret." That sentence stayed with Crockett long after she left. In the car ride back to the airport, she looked out the window and whispered to herself, "Hold the pen that fixes." It became her new motto. Over the following weeks, her work in Congress began to change. Instead of fiery speeches attacking judges, she started focusing on writing better laws. She reached across the aisle, working with members of both parties to craft bills on sentencing reform and rehabilitation. When reporters asked about her softer tone, she smiled and said, "Respect builds bridges. Anger burns them." Even her critics admitted she was different now. Calmer, wiser, more effective. Meanwhile, Judge Jones continued her duties quietly. But she too felt the ripple effect of that courtroom moment. In letters and emails from around the country, young law students wrote to her, saying they wanted to serve justice the way she did. With strength and humility, law schools began inviting her to speak about judicial independence. Every time she told the story of the Congresswoman who listened instead of argued, the audience fell silent, just as that courtroom once had. "Our system survives," she would say, "because good people remember that power means nothing without respect." Then one morning, about 6 weeks after their first meeting, a formal invitation arrived on the judge's desk. It was from the National Constitutional Symposium, the most respected annual gathering of legal minds in the country. They wanted Judge Jones to give the keynote address. But there was a note at the bottom, written in Crockett's handwriting. "I hope you'll consider sharing the stage with me." The judge smiled, folded the letter carefully, and said to her clerk, "Tell them I accept." When the day of the symposium arrived, the Grand Hall in Washington, D.C. was packed. The audience included senators, professors, students, and journalists. Cameras flashed. Everyone expected a serious lecture on law and government. Instead, what they got was something unforgettable. The two women walked on stage together. The older judge in her traditional black robe, the younger lawmaker in a simple navy suit. They stood side by side, the picture of wisdom and renewal. Judge Jones began, her voice steady but kind. "6 weeks ago, I met a young congresswoman who challenged the way I think about communication between branches of government. Today, I'm proud to call her a colleague and a friend." The audience applauded warmly. Then Crockett took the microphone. "When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I knew everything," she said with a small smile. "I was wrong. I learned that respect isn't surrender. It's partnership. We can fight for change and still honor the system that makes change possible." The applause grew louder, filling the hall. Cameras captured faces of people wiping tears from their eyes. It was not just another conference. It was a lesson in humility and hope. The women spoke together for almost an hour, trading stories and insights. The judge explained how laws evolve through patience, not pressure. Crockett described how she had learned to turn her frustration into productive reform. Together, they showed that two different generations, two different roles, could share one purpose: to make justice stronger by working together, not against each other. When they finished, the entire audience stood and clapped for a full 2 minutes. Later that night, news programs replayed the event under headlines like "From Clash to Collaboration" and "A Lesson in Respect for America." For once, the country seemed united around a positive story. But beyond the headlines, something more personal was changing in both women. Judge Jones realized that teaching and mentoring young leaders might be her most important work yet. She began holding small seminars for new members of Congress, explaining how judicial independence protected their own power as lawmakers. If the courts fall, she told them, so does the Congress, because the same Constitution shields us all. Crockett, for her part, became an advocate for civility. She started visiting universities, telling students how that single conversation with Judge Jones had changed her understanding of leadership. "You don't lose your passion when you listen," she told them. "You make it stronger." Slowly, the tone of national dialogue began to shift. Other lawmakers noticed the public's positive reaction to humility and started mirroring it. Debates became slightly less bitter. Journalists began asking new kinds of questions, not just who won or lost, but who learned. The spark that began in one courtroom was spreading softly but surely through the veins of the nation's public life. For Judge Jones, the letters kept coming, from citizens thanking her for reminding them that character still counts, from parents who said they showed their children the video to teach them respect, from retired judges who wrote simply, "You made us proud," and every time she read one, she thought about that moment when the young Congresswoman had asked, "Could you help me understand where I went wrong?" That question, she often said, was the most powerful sentence in democracy. As winter turned to spring, the two women met again, this time over coffee instead of microphones. They talked about life, family, and the future. At one point, Crockett looked out the cafe window and said quietly, "Judge, do you ever think one small moment can change everything?" The judge smiled. "It always does," she replied. "History doesn't turn on speeches. It turns on humility." They laughed softly. Two women from different worlds, united by the same purpose. Outside, the city moved as usual. Cars honking, people rushing. But inside that cafe, time seemed to slow. The light fell gently across the table, and for a brief moment, it felt like the spirit of the Constitution itself was sitting there with them, reminding them both that democracy isn't a battle to win. It's a conversation to keep alive. And little did they know, the most powerful outcome of their journey was still ahead. An event that would test everything they had learned about trust, respect, and leadership, and prove to the nation that true change always begins with a single honest heart. That single honest heart would soon face a new test. A few months after that quiet coffee meeting, America found itself in the middle of a heated national debate over judicial reform. Across television screens and newspaper headlines, arguments raged about whether Congress should pass new laws limiting the power of federal courts. Some politicians were calling for oversight. Others were demanding term limits for judges. The tension between the branches of government was growing again. Louder than before, sharper than ever. People were choosing sides. Anger was spreading, and the hope that Judge Jones and Representative Crockett had sparked seemed to be fading under the noise of politics. But neither woman was willing to let that happen. Judge Jones watched the news every night with concern. She could feel the same division she had spoken about returning to the national conversation. She knew words could heal, but she also knew they could harm. Meanwhile, in Washington, Crockett sat in her office late one evening, surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing computer screens. Her staff had drafted a statement pushing back against some of the court decisions that critics were calling obstacles to progress. She read the statement twice and then quietly pushed it aside. Something inside her told her this was the moment to prove that she had truly learned from Judge Jones. She picked up the phone, dialed a familiar number, and said, "Judge Jones, I think it's time we speak again. Not in a courtroom, but in front of the country." The judge listened in silence, then said gently, "If we do this, Congresswoman, let's make sure we speak to the heart, not the crowd." And with that, a plan began to form, a joint televised address. Not a debate, not a press conference, but a public conversation about respect, law, and leadership. When the news broke that a federal judge and a sitting member of Congress would appear together on national television, the nation took notice. Commentators called it unprecedented. Networks cleared prime time slots. Social media buzzed with curiosity. What would they say? Would it be polite or confrontational? No one knew. The night of the broadcast, millions tuned in. The set was simple. 2 chairs, 1 flag, and the words, "One nation, under law," glowing softly on a screen behind them. As the cameras went live, Judge Jones and Congresswoman Crockett walked onto the stage together. They shook hands and sat down facing each other, calm but serious. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Judge Jones began, her voice steady but warm. "Tonight isn't about winning an argument. It's about remembering what makes our country strong. The belief that disagreement can exist without disrespect." Crockett nodded and replied, "When we lose respect, we lose our ability to listen. And when we stop listening, democracy starts to fade." The words were simple, but they carried enormous weight. The 2 women talked for over an hour, not in fancy legal terms or political slogans, but in plain, heartfelt language. They explained how each branch of government had its role, how criticism could be healthy if it came with understanding, and how humility could bring healing where pride brought division. Judge Jones said softly, "The Constitution is not a weapon. It's a bridge. It connects generations, beliefs, and even disagreements." Crockett smiled and added, "And bridges don't fall when we walk across them together." As they spoke, something beautiful happened. The comments flooding in on the live feed turned positive. People who usually argued online began typing words like hope, respect, and finally. Veterans, teachers, and even young viewers who had never paid attention to civics were listening, really listening. The ratings soared higher than anyone expected. For the first time in years, a televised political discussion left Americans feeling uplifted instead of divided. When the show ended, the 2 women stood together, shaking hands once more as the audience in the studio rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Tears glistened in the eyes of some viewers. It was more than a conversation. It was a reminder of what the nation could be when people put principles above pride. In the weeks that followed, something even more remarkable happened. Congress formed a bipartisan committee on civic respect and reform. Inspired by their conversation, Judge Jones agreed to serve as an advisor. Representative Crockett was appointed co-chair. Together, they worked to design programs that taught young Americans about the Constitution, not as a dusty document, but as a living guide. They spoke at schools, town halls, and community centers across the country. Everywhere they went, crowds showed up, people of all backgrounds, all beliefs, united by curiosity and respect. At one event in Philadelphia, where the Constitution was signed centuries ago, an elderly veteran stood up during the Q&A and said, "Ladies, I fought for this country when I was 19. I've seen leaders come and go, but what I saw on that television reminded me what we're really fighting for. Not power, but principle." The room erupted in applause. Crockett's voice trembled when she thanked him, saying, "Sir, you just said what I've been trying to live since that day in court." Judge Jones added, "You honor us by reminding us that patriotism begins with respect." Word of their tour spread so widely that the White House invited them to meet with the president to discuss national civility initiatives. During that meeting, Judge Jones said quietly, "Mr. President, laws can't heal a divided heart, but example can." The president nodded, visibly moved, and later quoted her in a speech to Congress. It was a ripple effect of humility, a quiet movement reshaping how people talk to one another, in government and beyond. But not everyone welcomed it. There were critics who said the respect movement was naive. They claimed it distracted from real policy debates. Some accused Crockett of abandoning her ideals. Others said the judge had stepped outside her judicial lane. Both women faced harsh words and online attacks. Yet instead of responding with anger, they answered with patience. Crockett would often post, "Disagreement isn't disrespect. It's democracy in action." Judge Jones wrote an op-ed titled, "Respect is Not Weakness," that became one of the most widely read legal essays of the year. She wrote, "The Constitution survives because those who serve it remember that civility is not optional. It's essential." Slowly, even the critics began to soften, because while politics comes and goes, truth remains steady. And the truth was clear: something good had begun. Months later, as spring returned, Judge Jones and Crockett were invited to give the commencement address at a major law school. The auditorium was filled with graduates in black robes, their faces bright with excitement and nerves. Judge Jones spoke first, reminding them that every decision they would make, as lawyers, judges, or lawmakers, carried the weight of public trust. "When you wear the robe or hold the pen," she said, "remember that humility is the foundation of authority." Then Crockett took the podium and told her side of the story. How she had once spoken carelessly, how a single conversation had opened her eyes, and how change was possible when pride gives way to purpose. "You don't have to be perfect to lead," she said. "You just have to be willing to learn." The audience stood and cheered. In the front row, students wiped away tears. Professors clapped with pride. The dean later said it was the most inspiring commencement in the school's history. That evening, as the two women left the campus, they walked slowly under the golden glow of sunset. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air smelled of spring. Judge Jones turned to Crockett and said quietly, "You know, Congresswoman, I think our country might just be listening again." Crockett smiled and replied, "And I think it's because you never stopped believing it could." They laughed softly, two unlikely partners, bound by respect, walking side by side into the fading light. But their story didn't end there. A few weeks later, a new crisis hit, a controversial Supreme Court decision that reignited national protests. Tensions flared once again, and media outlets called both women for comment. Instead of adding fuel to the fire, they appeared together one more time, urging calm. "Let's read before we react," Judge Jones said. "Let's understand before we accuse." Crockett added, "Real change starts with listening, not shouting." Their words were replayed everywhere, on news channels, podcasts, and social media clips that reached millions. The phrase, "read before you react," became a popular slogan, printed on t-shirts, posters, and school walls. Teachers began using it to remind students to think critically before forming opinions. In many ways, the movement that began with a single moment of confrontation had turned into a national lesson in patience and unity. Years later, long after that first courtroom meeting, people still remembered that day when silence turned into applause. Judge Jones eventually retired from the bench, but her legacy grew stronger with time. She continued teaching, mentoring, and writing, often telling the story of a young congresswoman who showed America that humility could heal. Crockett went on to chair important committees in Congress and eventually helped pass one of the most significant bipartisan judicial reform bills in decades. A bill focused on fairness, transparency, and respect for judicial independence. During the signing ceremony, she paused, looked up at the cameras, and said, "This one's for Judge Jones." The audience clapped, and somewhere in that moment, it felt as if the whole nation was clapping along. In her later years, Judge Jones received countless awards for her service. But when asked which moment of her career she valued most, she always said the same thing: the day someone listened. And that is what people remembered. Not just the argument, not just the applause, but the listening. Because in the end, democracy doesn't depend on agreement. It depends on people willing to hear each other out. Their story became a documentary, taught in schools, and remembered as the day the courtroom listened. Generations after, students still watch the video in civics class, learning how a moment of confrontation became a lesson in grace. It reminded them that character and humility are the quiet powers that hold a nation together. And even now, as years pass and new debates rise, that moment stands as a timeless example of what it means to lead with heart. The story of Judge Jones and Congresswoman Crockett will always remind Americans that no matter how divided things seem, one honest conversation, one open mind, and one humble heart can still change the course of history. And that's why, if you believe that respect, humility, and courage can still guide this great nation, make sure you stay with us, because more stories like this are coming. Stories that prove wisdom never grows old and hope never runs out.